Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're talking about The Strokes. This is the story of how five friends from New York City didn't just revive rock music, they pretty much reinvented it. We're talking a total reset, from the way bands sounded to the way they looked. So the big question is, how did they pull it off? I mean, think about it. The world was all about nu metal and pop punk, so how did this one band become the quote-unquote saviors of rock and roll? All right, so to get to the bottom of that, we're going to look at their story in 4 parts. First, the New York scene they came out of. Then, how they became saviors of rock and roll. After that, the big hiatus and all the fractures within the band. And finally, their big comeback with the new abnormal. All right, part 1, the New York vacuum. You gotta understand, the city was just waiting for a spark. You have to remember, at the time, New York's rock scene was basically dead. It was in what you'd call a structural vacuum. All the big sounds, they were coming from the West Coast. You had grunge up in Seattle, and then pop punk and nu metal exploding out of California. Meanwhile, the city that birthed legends like the Ramones and the Velvet Underground, well, it had kind of lost its crown. It was a museum piece. So into this void steps this very unique group of guys. And what's fascinating is how they were all connected. It wasn't just a garage band story. These guys were linked through a web of really exclusive schools. You've got Julian Casablancas and Nikolai Francher meeting at the Lycée Français when they were just kids. Then Julian meets Nick Valenci and Fab Moretti at the Dwight School. And get this, he already knew Albert Hammond Jr. from a fancy Swiss boarding school, La Rose. So you've got this mix of elite, worldly background and pure, raw ambition. That's a potent combination. Okay, section 2, Saviors of Rock and Roll. This is where they forged their sound, their look, and their entire legacy. All starting with their debut album, Is This It? So what was the mission? Well, Julian Casablancas gave their producer Gordon Raphael a very specific directive. He said he wanted the band to sound like a group from the past that took a time trip into the future. Think about that for a second. It's not just, let's sound vintage, it's, let's sound vintage and futuristic at the same time. That's the key to everything. And how did they get that sound? Well, they basically threw out the rule book for modern recording. At a time when everything was super polished, they went the other way. Julian's vocals? He didn't use some expensive studio mic. He sang through a beat-up little PV practice amp. The drums? Instead of a dozen mics, they used just 3. It gave them this incredibly tight, raw, almost live-in-the-room feel. It was genius, really. And then there were the guitars. This is absolutely crucial. While everyone else was doing these heavy, chunky power chord riffs, the Strokes did something totally different. Nick and Albert weren't playing traditional lead and rhythm parts. No way. They were weaving these 2 complex, interlocking guitar lines together. They were melodic, they were poppy, and they created this texture that was instantly recognizable. That was their signature. And look, this wasn't just about the music. It was a whole aesthetic overhaul. They completely changed what a rock star looked like. You know that late 90s vibe, the beefy, gym rat, stoner skater look? Gone. Overnight. The Strokes brought in this androgynous, super slim silhouette. We're talking skinny jeans, beat-up vintage jackets, messed-up hair. It was thrift store chic, and it was a massive rejection of the excess of the time. It felt real, it felt attainable, and it was just effortlessly cool. And the ripple effect was insane. It was immediate. Suddenly, you had this explosion of bands that became known as the bands. The Killers, Kings of Leon, Arctic Monkeys, all of them were part of this new wave. Brandon Flowers from the Killers literally heard Is This It and threw out everything his band had been working on to start over. The Kings of Leon straight up said the Strokes were the reason they got a career. This one album created a template for a whole decade of rock music. But maybe the most perfect summary of their influence comes from Alex Turner of the Arctic Monkeys, who just flat out said in a song, "I just wanted to be one of the Strokes." I mean, what more do you need to say? It's a huge testament to their power. But here's the thing. When you're crowned the saviors, that comes with a ton of pressure. And that pressure, well, it started to cause some serious problems. Which brings us to part 3, the great hiatus and fracture. Because when success creates that much pressure, things tend to break. And you could see the cracks showing up really early on. For their second album, Room on Fire, they brought in Nigel Godrich, you know, the guy who produces Radiohead. A huge deal, but the whole thing fell apart after just 10 days. Godrich later called the experience soulless. He basically said he and Julian Casablancas were both control freaks, and it didn't work at all. Then, after their third album in 2006, they basically hit a wall. The band went on hiatus for 5 years. And this wasn't just a vacation. This was a full-on creative split. Everybody went off and did their own solo projects, and they were all completely different. Albert Hammond Jr. was doing classic rock. Julian was making wild synth pop. It really felt like the band was, as they put it, just naturally growing apart. And when they finally did get back together to make the album Angles, the whole process was a mess. It was famously dysfunctional. For the first time, they tried to write the songs democratically, as a full band. But here's the catch. Julian wasn't even there. The other 4 guys were in a studio in the Catskills, while Julian recorded all his vocals completely separately. It was bizarre. Guitarist Nick Valenzi later said, "I'll never record this way again." That tells you everything you need to know. Okay, part 4, a new abnormal renaissance. After all that tension, after almost breaking up for good, something pretty amazing happened. They found a new sense of freedom. So what was the big change? Well, after fulfilling their contract, they left their major label, RCA, and instead, they moved over to Colt Records, which happens to be Julian Casablancas' own label. This was huge. It meant a move from contractual obligation to complete creative autonomy. No more outside pressure, no more traditional album cycles. They were finally in charge of their own destiny. And with that new freedom, they staged one of the best comebacks in recent memory. They teamed up with the legendary producer Rick Rubin, and he helped them reconnect, to find that old chemistry again. The album they made, The New Abnormal, was just incredible. They were trying new things. The songwriting was more mature, more vulnerable. This wasn't just them getting the old band back together. This was a full-on creative renaissance. And you know what the perfect ending to that comeback story was? This. After nearly 20 years of changing music, of being called the saviors of rock, the Strokes finally won their first ever Grammy. It was for The New Abnormal. Talk about a perfect moment of validation. But maybe that wasn't the ending at all. Because according to Rick Rubin, their latest recording sessions have been something else entirely. He described setting the band up on a mountaintop in Costa Rica where they would perform concerts for the ocean. I mean, it sounds less like a recording session and more like a spiritual retreat. It's pretty clear that whatever passion was lost, it is 100% back. So after 25 years, what's next for the band that really defined rock for their generation? When you think about it, their journey has been incredible. From a gritty basement in New York to a mountaintop in Costa Rica, they've come full circle. They survived the insane hype, the pressure, the fights, and they came out the other side. They're not just survivors, they're an institution. And it leaves you wondering, what will their next chapter sound like?